The hero's journey is the mythological representation of mankind's passage through technological and moral development, and it is through fulfilling our heroic potential that we go further as a species. The extroverted hero is one who takes action in order to lead others and bring change to the world. The introverted hero is the discoverer of new wisdom and values, and works towards the ever-increasing advancement of society. However, Erich Neumann points to an alternative to introversion and extroversion, namely that of centroversion. In centroversion, the hero's journey is towards psychological transformation, not to change the world, but rather to change oneself. So far, the trend of consciousness that we have discussed has been towards strengthening the ego against the unconscious and against external authorities. But in order for the ego to transform, it is necessary and inevitable that it will succumb to psychological death. Although a psychological death can be a painful experience, which can throw a person into despair or existential anxieties, this loosening of the ego's stability actually creates the conditions for a psychological rebirth, wherein a person reemerges as a transformed individual. In mythology, we see this as the archetype of death and rebirth, which mirrors the process of psychic death and the regeneration of the ego into an improved version of itself. The myth of the Egyptian God Osiris, his battle against Set, and the birth of his son Horus depicts the process of centroversion and individuation. It can therefore be seen as a product of ancient Egypt's emerging consciousness. The Osiris myth was central to the ancient Egyptians' understanding of their own society, as every living pharaoh was considered an earthly incarnation of Horus, who transforms into Osiris upon death. The central theme of the Osiris myth is overcoming death. As Neumann writes, "Stability and indestructibility, the true goals of centroversion, have their mythological prototype in the conquest of death, in man's defenses against its power, for death is the primordial symbol of the decay and dissolution of the personality." Various aspects of Egyptian society were centered around overcoming death, from the building of the pyramids, which were elaborate tombs, to the fact that so much effort went into preserving the bodies of the dead. All of this stems from the psychological fear of death, not just the physical death of the body, but also psychic death, which causes the ego to dissolve. However, ancient Egyptian beliefs regarding the immortality of the Ka, which can roughly be described as a person's spirit, demonstrate an awareness of the principle of rebirth, wherein the ego reemerges. This principle of rebirth is common in religious beliefs, and arguably the most famous story of death and rebirth is that of Jesus Christ. However, this video will focus primarily on Osiris, highlighting the important features of the myth. As Neumann writes, "The fundamental trend of centroversion, the conquest of death through everlastingness, finds its mythological and religious symbol in Osiris." The myth begins with Osiris ruling all of Egypt. His jealous brother Set was a god of chaos and destruction, and can be seen as Osiris' shadow side, contrasting directly against Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of truth and order, which was symbolized by Osiris. Set is the epitome of darkness, evil, destructiveness. Being twin brother to Osiris, he is the archetypal antagonist. Different versions of the myth play out differently, but in most versions, Set kills Osiris and splits his body into various pieces. Here we see a mythological representation of the psychological experience which begins the process of individuation, namely when an encounter with one's shadow causes turmoil and chaos in the psyche. Osiris' body being split into various pieces is symbolic of the shattered ego, whose stability is ruined by an encounter with the shadow. At the individual level, encountering one's shadow means confronting aspects of yourself which are normally regarded as evil or as unwanted qualities, and so to encounter them causes your previous self-conception to shift. This is why it is very common in stories for the hero to face a crisis upon his initial encounter with his antagonist, as this represents what happens to our overinflated egos when we are forced to confront our personal shadows. This destruction of the ego is commonly known as ego death, and this phenomenon can occur in various contexts, but it can often feel like a negative experience, since to lose your ego is to, in some sense, lose your sense of identity and your sense of certainty. The dismemberment of Osiris' body stood in stark contrast to ancient Egypt's attempts to preserve the body of the dead. However, as stated before, The death of the ego enables the opportunity for it to be reborn anew. After his body is scattered, Osiris's wife, the goddess Isis, searches for each piece in order to reconstruct his body. This is heavily symbolic of the second stage of the individuation process, particularly in masculine psychology, wherein the obliteration of the masculine ego leads to a descent into the unconscious, and the feminine side of the personality, or the anima, is discovered. The masculine character of the ego is often filled with pride, and the rejection of emotion. In fact, one of the ego's functions is to hold back the emotions which arise from the unconscious. The death of the ego allows these feelings to come forth, and so the anima is felt to be a rejuvenating and humbling force in the psyche. The role of the anima in individuation is a complicated subject, but one thing she provides is the reconstruction of the ego, symbolized by Isis reconstructing the body of Osiris. This occurs because the anima, in contrast to the ego, is more open-minded, and therefore more willing to incorporate new information into the ego conception. In other words, it allows a person to accept who they truly are, since it is willing to contemplate aspects of the personality which were hitherto relegated to the personal shadow. This enables the ego to approximate its idea of itself closer to the true self. The fact that the anima has a connecting function, seeking to find connections between ideas, gives it the ability to reconstruct the ego into an improved version of itself, for which reason the anima is said to heal the wounded psyche. In the myth, Isis uses Osiris's rebuilt body to conceive her son Horus, and Osiris departs to become the god who presides over the afterlife. The god Horus is a symbol depicting the new ego, who emerged from the corpse of a deceased god, and is therefore representative of psychological rebirth. The ancient Egyptians believed that Horus and Osiris were essentially the same entity, Horus being the earthly representative of Osiris. Between the son who regenerates himself as a hero, his divine parentage, and the rebirth of the dead father in the son, there exists a fundamental relationship, which was formulated as I and the Father are one. While I have argued thus far that Osiris is symbolic of the old ego, he is also, particularly in his guise as god of the afterlife, a symbol representing the self, while Horus represents the ego. This is because the ego can be thought of as the self's representative on Earth, just as Horus is Osiris's representative in the Kingdom of Egypt. While there simultaneously exists a superordinate portion of the psyche, of which the ego is but a small part. This also evokes imagery of the union between the everlasting divine realm and the earthly mortal realm, since the self is fundamentally demonstrative of the union of the conscious ego and the psychological self, or in other words, who you are at a fundamental genetic level. These two realms of the psyche are often in conflict, but through individuation, a person's ego can approximate itself to who that person truly is. The sun is also a symbol of the new, psychologically transformed personality, since the son is a biological continuation of the Father. For this reason, Jesus, as the Son of God, is also a symbol of the self, since he represents the union of earthly mortality with heavenly divinity. In this way, the hero myth develops into the myth of self-transformation, the myth of man's divine sonship, which is latent in him from the beginning, but can only be realized through the heroic union of ego, Horus, with the self, Osiris. Horus returns to defeat Set, and thereby overcomes the destructive nature of the shadow, which has lost its chaotic potency, and can be integrated into the personality. Overcoming the shadow means to understand and accept it, and thereby gain power over it, instead of letting it run rampant, symbolized by the defeat of the antagonist, which is a mainstay of most heroic adventures. The resurrection of Osiris, in his new guise as Horus, is meant for this purpose, that is, to overcome the feeling of impotence and weakness, which comes with encountering the shadow. The stages in the process of centroversion enable the personality to become more and more resilient to ego death, and also enables us to become psychologically complete as we integrate more and more portions of our unconscious personality. None of these features are unique to the Osiris myth, but the myth does represent one of the earliest stories to exhibit these stages. While we have been emphasizing mythology in this series, it is important to also note how mythology once had a more central role in human societies, and therefore shaped human history. The Osiris myth emerges just as ancient Egypt begins to awaken from its long unconscious slumber. As I mentioned before, each living pharaoh was considered to be Horus, and each dead pharaoh was considered Osiris. And so the archetypal psychology of the human mind itself became the basis of Egyptian society. Even ancient Egypt's understanding of the mind and soul reflect a primitive understanding of the difference between the ego and the self, and the necessity of unifying the two. The Ka, which I have discussed in a slightly different interpretation before, was considered to be an important part of a person, but was not exactly the same as a person's living body, since they were said to return to their cause upon death, and it was similar in concept to a guardian angel. This means that the Ka also represents the self, since it was superordinate to a person's living body, i.e. their ego. Even various rituals and ceremonies were in celebration of the principle of rebirth and regeneration, making this archetype a sacred aspect of Egyptian culture. The story of Osiris, Set, Isis, and Horus serves as a way to depict psychological processes before the idea of psychology is even discovered. It is only when we look back through our modern lenses do we see that the patterns were always present at the beginning, that the archetypal stages of the human mind naturally become depicted in our works of art. The symbolism that gravitates around the figure of Osiris, writes Neumann, embraces the most primitive levels of a man's psychology, as well as its highest reaches. It has its source in prehistoric burial customs, and it finally ends with projections of the process known today as integration. The awakening of mankind is the reason we have created myths in the first place, to explain our external surroundings using our internal experiences, and therefore to feel deeply connected with the world around us. The myths, however, are not just products of our psychology, but serve to evolve and develop our minds as well, since we can each learn how to become individuated from these myths, whether we are conscious of the process or not. Through this process, mankind becomes more and more conscious, and will likely to do so far into the future. These symbols still arise today in the stories which awaken within us a feeling of archetypal participation in the grand destiny of the universe, and they serve as mirrors to reflect upon who we truly are, or who we could be were we to psychologically evolve as individuals, and undergo the experience of centroversion and individuation.